Was Saturn the sun? Seems like a good question. Was Saturn the sun in ancient times, or seen in history and mythology, skies, as the sun-like object? The Saturn theory, through comparative mythology, Roman Saturnalia festival, etc., suggests that Saturn may have been our first sun, or at least associated as our star. This is explored through David Talbot's Saturn myth, and perhaps starting to be explained through the Saturnian cosmologies of the Thunderbolt's electric universe theory, Alfred de Grazia, and other Immanuel Velikovsky-inspired catastrophism models and revised chronology. These diagrams of some proposed Saturn polar configurations may help visualize initially mind-bending concepts. The Sun and Saturn are two very different celestial objects, yet the Babylonians appeared to confuse the two. Or was it just the translators of the Babylonian texts? Thomson, in his introduction to his collection of astrological reports, has noticed that the planet Saturn was also designated as Samas, i.e., sun, by the Babylonian Assyrian astrologers, and he quotes the statement of Hyginus to the effect that Saturn was called the star of the sun. Sun and catastrophism. Saturn was named after the Roman god of agriculture and harvest. While the planet may have gotten its name from its golden color, like a field of wheat, it also had to do with its position in the sky. According to mythology, the god Saturn stole the position of king of the gods from his father Uranus. The throne was then stolen by Jupiter. Mythology of Planets, Universe Today.
Chonjiwang.
The Chonjiwang Bonpuri Chronicles of Shanjilong is a Korean creation myth, traditionally retold by shamans in the small island of Jeju-do. Despite its title, the supreme deity Chijjiwang, whose name means king of the heavens and of earth, serves mainly as a secondary character. The protagonists of the myth are instead the two sons of Shanjiwang, Great Star and Small Star. Chonjiwang Bonpuri, Wikipedia. Other peoples' EU variations also suggest different solar system configurations in our planet's recent history. Our gas giants that are brown dwarf-type stars everywhere else, and other planets perhaps usurping other planet kings for a short period or reflecting and basking in their glory. During Saturnalia festival period, around Christmas time, the roles of Roman households were reversed, with slaves becoming the master, in remembrance of when Saturn recently ruled the skies. It was a golden age. In a poem about a lavish Saturnalia under
Domitian,
Statius makes it clear that the emperor, like Jupiter, still reigns during the temporary return of Saturn, king of Saturnalia, Wikipedia. And the overthrow of Saturn symbolizes the demise of the old culture which worshipped this ancient god. According to Roman mythology, after Saturn was dethroned by his son Jupiter, Zeus, he hid himself, Latuit, in the countryside, called Latium, in his honor. At the invitation of the god Janus, he reigned together with his wife. Is that her name, really? Ops, over Rome's golden ages, bringing prosperity, abundance, and civilization. The Romans nostalgized that legendary state as the golden age of Latium. Many of the rites of the Saturnalia were intended to restore that long-lost utopia, if only for a short time each year. Saturnalia recalling an ancient age. Was Saturn the original sun? Was Saturn a brown dwarf star where planet Earth resided during the Golden Age? Perhaps during the Saturn polar configuration. And yet the profile of the great sun gods presents a fascinating dilemma. During the past century, several authorities noticed that Greek and Latin astronomical texts show a mysterious confusion of the sun, Greek Helios, Latin Sol, with the outermost planet, Saturn. Though the designation seems bizarre, the expression star of Helios or star of Sol was applied to Saturn. Of the Babylonian star worshippers, the chronicler Diodorus writes, "To the one we call Saturn they give a special name, sun star." Similarly, the Greek historian Nonus, Nonus, gives Kronos as the Arab name of the sun. Though Kronos meant only Saturn and no other celestial body, Hyginus, in listing the planets, names first Jupiter, then the planet of Sol. Others say Saturn. A Greek ostracon, cited by the eminent classicist Franz Boll, identifies the Egyptian sun god Ra, not with our sun, but with the planet Saturn. This repeated confusion of the sun and Saturn seems to make no sense at all. Can you imagine any difficulty in separating the two bodies, or distinguishing the one from the other? One fact beyond dispute is that the word Helios did come from the Greek word for our sun, just as the Latin Sol gave his name to our sun. The same can be said for the older Shamash and Ra. The names of these gods became the names of the solar orb. But that's where the connection with our sun ends, and the mystery of Saturn, the universal monarch, begins. As strange as it may seem, early astronomical traditions identify the primeval sun as the planet Saturn, the distant planet which alchemists called the best sun, and which the Babylonians, the founders of astronomy, identified as the exemplary light of heaven, the sun god Shamash. Shamash is the planet Saturn. The astronomical texts say, in archaic copies of Plato's Timaeus, the word for the planet Saturn is Helios, the sun god. Popular Greek tradition identified Saturn as Kronos, alter ego of Helios, and Kronos is said to have ruled over the pole. But only a handful of scholars have bothered to trace the parallel reference in other cultures, or to address the unanswered questions. Saturn in ancient times, thunderbolts. Picture of the day. The Popol Vuh, lauded as the Mayan Bible, attests to the same idea. There, a previous sun god is described as follows. Like a man was the sun when it showed itself. We've heard this before. It showed itself when it was born and remained fixed in the sky like a mirror. Certainly it was not the same sun which we see, it is said in their old tales. The Saturn myth, Maverick science. A golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos, when he was reigning in heaven, and they lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil. Miserable age rested not on them. What happened to them? Works and Days, Hesiod, Velikovsky Archive. Peoples that remembered early tragedies enacted in the sky by the heavenly bodies asserted that Jupiter drove Saturn away from its place in the sky. Before Jupiter, Zeus became the chief god. Saturn, Kronos, occupied the celestial throne. And in all ancient religions, the dominion passes from Saturn to Jupiter. In Greek mythology, Kronos is presented as the father and Zeus as his son, who dethrones him. Kronos devours some of his children. After this act, Zeus overpowers his father, puts him in chains, and drives him from his royal station in the sky. In Egyptian folklore or religion, the participants of the drama are said to be Osiris, Saturn, brother and husband of Isis, Jupiter, the worship of Saturn in the beginning, Emmanuel Velikovsky, and I've read that. I may read it again. Here is a remarkable fact. Though numerous figures of the universal monarch are translated conventionally as the sun god, the celestial power invoked by the world's first religion is not the body we call the sun today. In fact, the star worshippers specifically distinguished it from our sun by calling it best sun, the primeval sun, the central sun. There has to be something to it. Of course, you know, the water and oxygen and salt match as well on the scientific side. Natives of Mexico recall that prior to the present age, an exemplary sun ruled over the world. But this was not the sun of today. His name, Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl. The Maya maintained essentially the same idea, calling the primeval sun Hurricane. The Incas of Peru spoke of a former superior sun to the present sun. The ancient Egyptians, the sun god Atum-Ra, the model ruler, reigned over the fortunate area for a time, then retired from the world. The Sumerian An, ruling with terrifying splendor, was the central luminary in the sky, but not our sun, and later departed to a more remote domain. When it comes to the well-known sun gods of early man, nothing in the mythical record seems to have unnerved the experts. As to the original solar character of the Greek Helios, Latin Sol, Assyrian Shamash, or Egyptian Ra, scholars have maintained an unwavering confidence. And surely you can see why. Could it really be doubted that Helios, radiating light from his brow, is our sun? Saturn, the ancient sun god, David Talbot. Saturn did not move on its present remote orbit, but ruled as the central sun around which the other heavenly bodies visually revolved. The words used by ancient civilizations that are interpreted today as the sun, like the Egyptian Ra, the Greek Helios, and the Roman Sol, all originally referred to the gas giant Saturn. Was that planet our primordial parent? Was Saturn until recently a much larger brown dwarf? The apparent size and color of an electric star is an electrical phenomenon. If Jupiter's magnetosphere was lit up, it would appear the size of the full moon. Was ancient man around to see it as a sun? If not, why would anyone call a faint yellowish speck in the night sky the sun? Other stars, other worlds, other life, hollow science. Kronos was confused with, or perhaps consciously identified with, due to the similarity in name, the Titan Kronos, already in antiquity, the identification becoming more widespread during the Renaissance, giving rise to the allegory of Father Time wielding the harvesting scythe or sickle. He was depicted in Greco-Roman mosaics as a man turning the zodiac wheel, Kronos, however, also be contrasted with the deity Ion as eternal time. Kronos is usually portrayed through an old wise man with a long gray beard, such as Father Time. In Greek mythology, Kronos, in pre-Socratic philosophical works, is said to be the personification of time. He emerged from the primordial chaos. He is often mythologically confused with the Titan Kronos. He was depicted in Greco-Roman mosaics as a man turning the zodiac wheel, Often the figure is named Eon, eternal time, a common alternate name for the god. His name actually means time, and is alternatively spelled Chronos, Khronos, transliteration of the Greek Chronos, or Cronus, Latin version. Saturn in mythology. Now, even though Velikovsky points out that Saturn was once much more massive body than it is today, it is hard to imagine that it could have been massive enough to be a star, in the context of the thermonuclear theory of stellar energy. If, however, it was an electrically fueled star, its initial stellar state and its sudden demise seem readily explainable. Ralph Jurgens, Earth is a Satellite of Saturn, Velikovsky Archive. In fact, it may well be both Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn were at one time minor stars, and that their satellite systems were formed as the result of minor or planetary nova outbursts. C. E. R. Bruce, A New Approach in Astrophysics and Cosmology.
There's nothing to fear. The gas giant Saturn. It's the outermost planet visible to the naked eye, moving on an orbit almost 900 million miles from the Sun. For those untrained in finding planets in the night sky, it could hardly be said that Saturn stands out amongst its starry companions. This lack of distinction underscores an unsolved mystery. Where did all of the extravagant images attached to this distant speck in the sky come from? The story of Saturn as creator. Saturn presiding over a lost golden age. Saturn as a primeval sun. Saturn's preposterous location at the celestial pole around which the heavens visually turn. Saturn as the founding father of kings. And Saturn as dying or displaced god. In due course, we'll take up the god's connection to an immense crescent, seen as a scythe or sickle turning in the sky. So too the cosmic mountain from which Saturn was said to have once ruled the world. And the planet god's role as divine ancestor of different nations, all recounting the same core idea. The mysteries will quickly overwhelm a researcher the moment he asks the present sky to explain the ancient themes. In fact, many scholars simply walked away from the dilemma. Here's the dilemma in a nutshell. The myths appear to be much older than any recorded observations of planets. The first flowering of the monumental civilizations occurred in an environment of myth and magic. There are no lists of planets, no diaries of planetary motions. The celebrated gods do not look at all like the planets we know so well today. So most scholars simply state that planetary behavior could not have provoked any of the great myths. The attachment of myths to planets must have come much later, perhaps in the first millennium BC. Our message, however, is that a radically different planetary arrangement prevailed in an earlier time. Planets, not in their present orbits, but planets, provoked all of the mythic archetypes. What we're offering in this series are reasons for known facts, things not disputed. This includes the fact that the astronomer priests themselves, in recording the tranquil and predictable motions of planets in later times, named these bodies explicitly as the great gods of the primeval epoch. And that's the heart of the dilemma. Why does the behavior of these most venerated gods so boldly contradict all observations of the named planets today? By working with the points of cross-cultural agreement, we'll see that the astronomical images of Saturn connect theme by theme with an archaic story told around the world, told long after most cultures had lost track of any planetary connections. The story says that in a former time, a central luminary, a motionless sun, turned as a great wheel in the sky. But why an identification with the planet Saturn? It's said that this ancient power, the father of kings, presided over an age of natural abundance and cosmic harmony. But this story, in its countless variations, does not end well. It states that the world fell into confusion when the ruling god fled the theater or tumbled from his appointed station. Then the hordes of chaos were set loose and all of creation slipped into a cosmic night, the gods themselves battling furiously in the heavens, the clash of the titans. In the well-known Greek tradition, this was the story of the displaced god Kronos, the father of kings. Kronos was the Greek name for the planet Saturn. And yet, enigmatically, the same planet was also named Helios, the sun, a fact that has perplexed classical scholars for a century and a half. The shadow cast by Saturn reached across the millennia. Even today, our language retains the age-old cultural ambivalence toward this most ancient god. The word Saturnian expresses the splendor of the Golden Age, while the word Saturnine reflects the melancholy of paradise lost. Guesses as to explanations will never work, but an explanation based on systematic, cross-cultural investigation will work, allowing a global story to mean what it says, even if that requires a measure of patience as verifiable pieces come one by one into a coherent picture of the ancient sky.
The worship of Saturn, Saturn, so active in cosmic changes, was regarded by all mankind as the supreme god. Seneca says that Epigenes, who studied astronomy among the Chaldeans, estimates that the planet Saturn exerts the greatest influence upon all the movements of the celestial bodies. On becoming a nova, it ejected filaments in all directions, and the solar system became illuminated as if by 100 suns. It subsided rather quickly and retreated into faraway regions. Peoples that remembered early tragedies enacted in the sky by the heavenly bodies asserted that Jupiter drove Saturn away from its place in the sky. Before Jupiter, Zeus became the chief god. Saturn, Kronos, occupied the celestial throne. In all ancient religions, the dominion passes from Saturn to Jupiter. In Greek mythology, Kronos is presented as the father and Zeus as his son, who dethrones him. Kronos devours some of his children. After this act, Zeus overpowers his father, puts him in chains, and drives him from his royal station in the sky. If Egyptian folklore or religion, the participants of the drama are said to be Osiris, Saturn, brother and husband of Isis, Jupiter. The cult of Osiris and the mysteries associated with it dominated the Egyptian religion as nothing else. Every dead man or woman was entombed with observances honoring Osiris. The city of Abydos in the desert west of the Nile and northwest of Thebes was sacred to him. Sais in the delta, used to commemorate the floating of Osiris' body carried by the Nile into the Mediterranean, what made Osiris so deeply ingrained in the religious memory of the nation that his cult pervaded mythology and religion. Osiris' dominion before his murder by Seth was remembered as a time of bliss. According to the legend, Seth, Osiris' brother, killed and dismembered him, whereupon Isis, Osiris' wife, went on peregrinations to collect his dispersed members. Having gathered them and wrapped them together with swathings, she brought Osiris back to life. The memory of this event was a matter of yearly jubilation among the Egyptians. Osiris became lord of the netherworld, the land of the dead. A legend, a prominent part of the Osiris cycle, tells that Isis gave birth to Horus, whom she conceived from the already dead Osiris, and that Horus grew up to avenge his father by engaging Seth in mortal combat. In Egyptology, the meaning of these occurrences stands as an unresolved mystery. The myth of Osiris is too remarkable and occurs in too many divergent forms not to contain a considerable element of historic truth, wrote Sir Alan Gardner, the leading scholar in these fields. But what historical truth is it? Could it be of an ancient king upon whose tragic death the entire legend hinged? Wondered Gardner. But of such a king, not a trace has been found before the time of the pyramid texts. And in these texts, Osiris is spoken of without end. There he appears as a dead god or king or judge of the dead. But who was Osiris in real life? Asked Gardner. At times, he is represented to us as the vegetation which perishes in the floodwater mysteriously issuing from himself. He is associated with brilliant light. After the life of studying Egyptian history and religion, Gardner confessed that he remained unaware of whom Osiris represented or memorialized. The origin of Osiris remains for me as insoluble mystery, nor could others in this field help him find the answer. The Egyptologist John Wilson wrote that it is an admission of failure that the chief cultural content of Egyptian civilization, its religion, its mythological features, again and again narrated and alluded to in the text and represented in statues and temple reliefs, is not understood. The astral meaning of Egyptian deities was not realized, and the cosmic events of their activities were not thought of. The prophet Ezekiel in the Babylon exile had a vision, the likeness of a man, but made of fire and amber, who lifted him by the lock of his hair and brought him to some darkened chamber where the ancients of the house of Israel, with censers in their hands, were worshipping idols portrayed upon the wall round about. Then the angel of the vision told him, "Thou shalt see greater abominations that they do." And he brought the prophet to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Next he showed him also Jews in the inner court of the Lord's house, with their back toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, that they worshipped the sun toward the east. The worship of the sun and the planets was decried by Jeremiah, a contemporary of Ezekiel. But what was this weeping for Tammuz? Tammuz was a Babylonian god. One of the months of the year, approximately coinciding with July, in the summer, was named in his honor. And by this very name, it is known in the present-day Hebrew calendar, Tammuz was the god that died and was then hidden in the underworld. His death was the reason for a fast. accompanied by lamentations of the women of the land. His finding or his return to life and resurrection were the motifs of the Passion. Tammuz was the god of vegetation, of the flood, and of seeds. The god Tammuz came from Armenia every year in his ark in the overflowing river, blessing the alluvium with new growth. In the month of Tammuz he was bound, and the liturgies speak of his having been drowned among flowers, which were thrown upon him as he sank beneath the waves of the Euphrates. The drowning of Tammuz was an occasion for wailing by women. The flood has taken Tammuz. The raging storm has brought him low. Of Tammuz, it is also narrated that he was associated with brilliant light, with descent into the netherworld, visited by Ishtar, his spouse. Tammuz's death, his subsequent resurrection, or his discovery in the far reaches, but no longer brilliant, were the themes of the cult that was not just one of the mysteries, but the chief and paramount cult. The Osirian mysteries, the wailing for Tammuz, all refer to the transformation of Saturn during and following the deluge. Osiris was not a king, but the planet Saturn, Kronos of the Greeks, Tammuz of the Babylonians. Babylonians called Saturn the star of Tammuz. After the deluge, Saturn was invisible. The sky was covered for a long time by clouds of volcanic dust. And the Egyptians cried for Osiris, and the Babylonians cried for Tammuz. Isis, Jupiter at that time, went in search of her husband, and Ishtar, also Jupiter at that early time, went to the netherworld to find her husband Tammuz. For a time Saturn disappeared, driven away by Jupiter, and when it reappeared, it was no longer the same planet. It moved very slowly. The disappearance of the planet Saturn in the netherworld became the theme of many religious observances, compromising liturgies, mystery plays, lamentations, and fasts. When Osiris was seen again in the sky, though greatly diminished, the people were frenzied by the return of Osiris from death. Nevertheless, he became king of the netherworld. In the Egyptian way of seeing the celestial drama, Isis, Jupiter, the spouse of Osiris, Saturn, wrapped him in swathings. Osiris was known as the swathed, the way the dead came to be dressed for their journey to the world of the dead, over which Osiris reigns. Similar rites were celebrated in honor of Adonis, who died and was resurrected after a stay in the Netherland, in the mysteries of Orpheus. Sir James G. Fraser, the collector of folklore, came to regard Osiris as a vegetation god. Likewise, he saw in the Babylonian Tammuz an equivalent of the Egyptian Osiris, a vegetation god, and carried away by this concept, wrote his The Golden Bow, built around the idea of the vegetation god that dies and is resurrected the following year. A few peoples, through consecutive planetary ages, kept fidelity to the ancient Saturn, or Kronos, or Brahma, whose age was previous to that of Jupiter. Thus the Scythians were called Manda by the Chaldeans, people of Manda, and Manda is the name of Saturn. The Phoenicians regarded El Saturn as their chief deity. Eusebius informs us that El, a name used also in the Bible as a name for God, was the name of Saturn. In Persia, Saturn was known as Kevan or Kavan. The different names for God in the Bible reflect the process of going through many ages in which one planet superseded another and was again superseded by the next one in the celestial war. El was the name of Saturn, Adonis of the Syrians. The bewailed deity was also like Osiris, the planet Saturn. But in the period of the contest between the two major planets, Jupiter and Saturn, the appellative of the dual gods became Adonai, which means my lords. Then, with the victory of Jupiter, it came to be applied to him alone. Emanuel Velikovsky.
the cradle of life. And this gets back to the idea of the Garden of Eden period in man's memory. If you're a satellite orbiting within that anode glow, and this is not an outrageous idea because astronomers have suggested the same thing for red giants, that planets could actually orbit within that star because the atmosphere is such low density. In fact, we orbit in the sun's atmosphere, if you like, and it doesn't cause us any trouble. But within that glowing shell, the radiant energy received from that envelope is constant over the entire globe. The light from the plasmasphere is not reflected light, it's radiant energy. Brown dwarfs radiate blue and ultraviolet light even though they are cool at a temperature around 950 K. This is further evidence that we are looking at a mix of an electrical red anode glow and coronal ultraviolet blue end of the spectrum. There are no seasons, no tropics and no ice caps. A planet does not have to rotate, its axis can point in any direction and its orbit can be eccentric, and you'll still get this beautiful even temperature over the whole body. The radiant energy received by the planet will be strongest at the blue and red ends of the spectrum, so photosynthesis, which relies on red light, would be very active. The skylight would be a pale purple, which maybe is referred to by the classical purple dawn of creation. And I know that in Canberra we have this new arboretum, which is fantastic, and all of the new trees that are being planted are put in red plastic to start with. And I asked the head of the arboretum why they did that, and he said the plants grow much better in red light. Water molecules dominate the spectra of brown dwarfs. So you want to know where the Earth's water came from? The light on Earth was dim and purplish amid a continuous mist of water. No other bodies in the system were visible. And this is what Dave mentioned yesterday. This explains the abundant water on Earth and many satellites of the gas giant planets and the rings of Saturn. And the red light, warmth and water was ideally suited for giant ferns. It explains the gigantic lush vegetation found at the poles, fossilised as coal. Now, the problem faced by life on planets orbiting a red star, I think you saw last night, which was this flaring red dwarf. So this tendency to flare up is a problem. The reason for this is that, as I said, the red stars don't have the current regulation afforded by the bright photosphere. So the response of a red star to a sudden electrical disturbance in their environment is to shed charged matter in a flare-up. They may also change in apparent size as the anode glow accommodates to the electrical environment. I think this would account for the great dyings in the geological record and the episodic deposit of vast sediment and mineral layers on the Earth. And on other bodies too. Every body that's been looked at is layered. What's more, it explains for the first time the oceans of salty water on Earth. Comets cannot be responsible because they have little or no water and little or no sodium chloride. Now, just see how much of this I want to show you because we saw this yesterday, so I might skip. This is referring to that super flare you saw yesterday, and you remember the astrophysicist said anyone who was on a planet orbiting that star at the time would be having a very bad day. Well, I think the Earth has had its bad days, and they're reflected in the geological record. So we'll skip that. The mass extinctions. As I said, those flare-ups can be so drastic that it would practically wipe out the life on any existing life on those satellites of that dwarf star. This raises an interesting side issue, and that is, ironically, intelligent life can't communicate through such a plasma shell using radio waves. So the lack of intelligible radio signals in the SETI project is understandable. In fact, denizens of such worlds would most likely be unaware of the universe at large. Now, astronomers also submit that orbiting a red dwarf is possibly one of the best places to look for life. What they've never considered is orbiting inside a red dwarf. Let me see. I don't think I'll talk about this one. This is a recent report of a spotty brown dwarf which suggests there are things orbiting within that red anode sheath, causing a dimming of the glow behind wherever that satellite happens to be. They're calling it weather, but of course if it's an anode glow it has nothing to do with weather. So we'll skip that. So this is a picture of the brown dwarf proto-Saturn as I see it. Now there would have been many more bodies than you see there, but I've included Mars and Earth and proto-Saturn because they're the main players at this stage. 50% of red dwarfs have Earth-sized planets in their conventional habitable zone. This suggests there are a large number hidden inside the red star's glow. And you can say that too because our gas giants all have large numbers of satellites orbiting quite closely. But you'll note there is no Venus at this stage. Gigantism. It wasn't just pterodactyls that struggled to get up off the ground. Scaling of muscle and bone strength shows that dinosaurs could not have raised their bodies off the ground in today's gravity. For them to move about, Earth's gravity needed to be about 1/3 of today's. Global extinction and fossilization requires far more than a simple impact. Clearly, we have no understanding of the cause of gravity. Is gravity electrical? The question is of fundamental importance for cosmology and our understanding of the solar system. And the answer should provide insights into the demise of the dinosaurs, the sky our ancestors saw, and why they feared doomsday.